Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Paul D'Ambrosio. I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University. Today the四海为学Collaborative Learning Project is very happy to host Professor Jana Rošker and her talk, Transcultural Approaches to Chinese Philosophy and Methods of Sublimation. We also want to thank Professor Thea, I forget how to say your last name again.
Sernelj.
Sernelj, for chairing this session.
Brilliant, super. Yeah.
Thank you, yeah. You're a great teacher, what can I say? And Professor Mathew Foust and Professor Anping White for providing comments. And I'd like to remind everyone that there will be an additional discussion session next week. So there's details on the website, and I'll also post a link in the chat. The time might change, so check the website in a couple of days, but it should be either next Wednesday or next Friday. So the 四海为学 project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the conventional practices in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we're not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism and self-promoting. We also hope to curb some of the forms of aggressive and look at me, I'm smarter than you type of attitudes that happen sometimes in academic exchanges. 四海为学 hopes to accomplish this change in academic orientation by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions and responses, and generally cooperative learning together. As many of us know all too well, miscommunication or missed communication can have disastrous results, from ordering the wrong food to starting wars. With the goal of fostering real, honest, humble exchange and open communication, 四海为学 encourages unselfish, anti-egoist, sort of don't be a jerk and let's try to actually learn together type of academic exchange. Here we have less of an emphasis on learning about Chinese philosophy and focus more on learning from Chinese philosophy. So I don't actually know what Jana is going to say in her talk, but I do know her pretty well, and I think that her talk will exemplify this type of orientation pretty well. So that's basically it for me, and I hand things over now to Professor Thea
Sernelj.
Sernelj.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. So as Paul already said, we are very honored to host our speaker today, whom I will be introducing in just a moment. We also are very happy to host the two commentators, Professor Mathew Foust and Professor Anping White, whom I will be introducing after the lecture. So distinguished Professor Jana S. Rošker studied sinology and obtained her PhD degree at the Vienna University. She is the first Slovene sinologist, co-founder and long-standing head of the Department of Asian Studies at the University in Ljubljana, which is, by the way, in Slovenia. For those who don't know this country, it is one of the smallest country, I would say, in the world, only 2 million people. So altogether, Jana Rošker spent over 10 years in China and Taiwan at several universities and research institutes. Her academic interests include Chinese methodology, Chinese epistemology, Chinese logic, and modern New Confucianism. In these research areas, she has published over 25 books and over 150 articles and book chapters. She is a chief editor of the journal Asian Studies, the vice president of the International Society for Chinese Philosophy, and the founder, first president and honorary member of the European Association for Chinese Philosophy. She was awarded with several prestigious awards, as for instance, the National Slovene Research Agency Prize for Extraordinary Scientific Achievements, the Golden Plaque of the University of Ljubljana, the National Prize for Research Work of National Significance, and in the last year, the French Taiwanese Cultural Foundation Prize and the Most Excellent Research Work Award of the University of Ljubljana. So as we can see, the title of this lecture is Transcultural Approaches in Chinese Philosophy and the Method of Sublation, which is the topic that is extensively elaborated in her book published in 2021 by Bloomsbury, entitled Interpreting Chinese Philosophy, a New Methodology. So without further ado, I leave the floor to you, Jana.
Thank you very much, Thea. Although this was really, I just have to set the time. This was really somehow a little bit too much of kindness in your introduction. But now I would like also to thank, of course, my long-standing young friend, Paul D'Ambrosio, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today, to be able to deliver this little talk. And, but of course, I would be much more delighted if I could be there, if I could meet all of you in person. And so we could afterwards have a more lively discussion and then a party or something. Whatever. I will now begin. My presentation will be dealing with some questions that I have been dealing with in my recent research, or actually in my research for the last years already. And I would like actually to expose some of the problems of the traditional comparative philosophy, transcultural philosophy, especially, of course, because I'm a sinologist, especially regarding Chinese and Western philosophy. And then towards the end of my talk, I would like to briefly discuss or present a new approach, a new principle I'm working with at the moment. This is, of course, a work in progress, but this is an approach which I tentatively call the method of sublation. Why the method of sublation? I will explain this in my lecture, but let's start now. As already mentioned, I would like to address some problems in this lecture, which, do you see the second slide? Okay, because sometimes there can be some technical problems with these PPTs. I have experienced that in some lectures. But I would like to address some problems encountered by Western scholars working in the field of Chinese philosophy and also Chinese epistemology, Chinese logic, all these different fields. And I will begin with a discussion of cross-cultural and transcultural methodologies. Then I will highlight some of the most common problems encountered in traditional cross-cultural comparisons in the field of Chinese philosophy. And then, considering the current state of the so-called post-comparative discourses in the field of transcultural philosophy, and starting from the notion of the culturally divergent frames of reference, I will focus on semantic aspects of Chinese philosophical tradition and demonstrate the need for discursive translations. So on this basis, I will then suggest this new so-called post-comparative approach in transcultural philosophical studies of Chinese philosophy. And So in the framework of these new approaches, the one I'm working with, the one I'm developing is certainly not the only one. There are many new approaches, but I propose the application of the method which I tentatively call the method of sublation. So this is actually how this talk will be structured today. I apologize in advance because it is somehow a little bit more theoretical introduction, but it is a complex. This method of sublation is somehow complex method, and it is difficult to demonstrate it on a concrete example in such a brief time. So I will, in this talk, concentrate on the methodological backgrounds which have led me to the development of this method. Now, let us start with clarifying the notions of cross-cultural, intercultural, and transcultural. These are some terms that are very often used in comparative philosophy, dealing with philosophies which have been developed in different cultures, but they don't have yet a unified meaning. This means that the connotations of these three terms are not being agreed upon by the whole academia with working in this field. So they can be applied differently by different scholars, and you can also see, if you look at the different encyclopedias or dictionaries, there will be different definitions of these three terms. So I thought, because they are somehow also very important for this lecture, I'm going first to introduce how I understand these three terms. So in which connotations I myself use these three terms, so there will be no misunderstandings. So cross-cultural studies, as I understand them, not only me, but a bunch of other people also, they refer to different cultures or comparisons between them in a very general sense. It means that cross-culturality means simply to crossing the boundaries of one culture and entering into the discourses shaped by another. So if I'm a Western scholar and I'm dealing with Chinese philosophy in my research, I'm of course dealing with cross-cultural studies. Then interculturality is a more specific type of communication or interaction between different intellectual, linguistic, and cognitive traditions, where the differences between cultures and the corresponding linguistic structures have a decisive influence on the formation of meaning. This means that intercultural interactions certainly involve the process of transferring meanings, implications, connotations between different cultures and different languages. So nevertheless, numerous current theorists criticize the very notion of cross-interculturality or interculturality, with their problematic embedding into a static and one-dimensional understanding of cultures as some kind of fixed realms or spheres or islands. So they are traditional intercultural studies, traditional cross-cultural studies are actually working with a very outdated essentialistic notion of culture. So in such a view, the very idea of culture, of course, is defined by a separatist, essentialistic, and isolating character. So many contemporary scholars argue instead for a transcultural approach, because the prefix trans contained in the notion of transculturality suggests that it is capable of transcending the boundaries and limits of what? Of course, of fixed and static notion of culture. In this sense, it suggests the possibility of going beyond the fragmentation and separation of different cultures and philosophies, thus creating a more inclusive and enriching approach to philosophies. So, and also this prefix, trans, what it is also telling us, or what it implies, is that all the elements that are involved into such a comparisons of different cultures are being in the very process of this comparison or juxtaposition are being transformed. The objects of comparisons and also the subject of comparison or comprehension. So such approaches aim at overcoming the outdated, static, and immobile concept of culture, but this, of course, does not mean that there is no culture. Culture, of course, it's still a real thing, like language, for instance. Both are dynamic, historically grown, and constantly changing entities without fixed borders. So the ontological assumption underlying the concept of culture does no longer refer to a metaphysics of an abstract substance or a substantial entity. Here, in such approaches, the notion of culture is understood to be based on a metaphysics of relations instead. So there is no substance, but there are relations. And what relations are that we are talking about when we are talking about transcultural approaches? These are relations between different dynamic elements that constitute what we understand under the concept of culture. For instance, between religions and other beliefs, between languages, grammatical structures, between specific historical developments, political systems, and so on. So these are all very much changeable elements that constitute through their relation that what we understand when we talk about cultures. So on the basis of this reflection, let us return to our basic question. And this basic question is linked to problems encountered by Western or also Western trained scholars who are dealing with Chinese philosophy. So from the transcultural point of view, working in Chinese philosophy and interpreting classical Chinese texts, of course, has a lot to do with transferring meanings across different languages and different patterns of understanding. But as we all know, concepts and categories cannot be simply and directly transferred from one sociocultural context into another. The semantic connotations by which they are defined often simply don't overlap. They don't always overlap. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So it is a problem. Therefore, we must consider, when we are dealing with concepts from different cultures, we must consider what I call the referential frameworks into which they are embedded, these concepts. So what is a referential framework? Actually, what we are here confronting is a universal problem, which has been discussed by a broad scope of Western theorists of science like Kuhn, Quinn, Lakatos, Feyerabend, and Foucault also a little bit. So it is not only a phenomenon that we encounter when we are dealing with different cultures. Actually, every theory is embedded in such a semantic network, in such a framework of reference, which determines the meaning of individual terms and also the relations between them. For instance, Fan Yaoming, who was also writing a lot about this referential framework. Feng Yaoming is important analytical philosopher from Hong Kong. He wrote that we can imagine that when we remember the differences between Newton's and Einstein's theories of physics, they are both written in English. He said, although this is not true because Einstein's theory was first written in German, but this is still the same family of languages. These are the Indo-European languages, and the grammar structures are quite similar. So, and they also work with the same concepts, but because the two theories are embedded into two different referential frameworks, the functions and the semantic connotations of these same notions applied in each of them are also different. So Thomas Kuhn, for instance, has called this phenomenon paradigms. He was, of course, as most of you know, the author here of a brilliant book named The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and there he was talking about the paradigm shift. What happens when one paradigm in the theoretical development of science is replaced by another? So a paradigm shift does not only change the meanings of particular terms or notions, it changes all meanings of all central notions applied within a theory. So I think that in this context, actually the term paradigm is a bit too broad, too general, because we all know that paradigm in theory only means actually a basic theoretical pattern. But notwithstanding the name, the problem remains the same. As we can see in this slide, what we are talking about is a coherent semantic network of meanings and their mutual relations. So Thomas Kuhn, for instance, in his book about the structure of scientific revolutions has described this in the following way. He said, within the new paradigm, old terms, concepts, and experimentals fall into new relationship, one with the other. The inevitable result is what we must call, though the term is not quite right, a misunderstanding between the two competing schools. Consider, for example, the man who called Copernicus mad because he proclaimed that the earth moved. They were not either wrong or just wrong. Part of what they meant by earth was a fixed position. So their earth at least could not move. Correspondingly, Copernicus' innovation was not simply to move the earth. Rather, it was a whole new way of regarding the problems of physics and astronomy, one that necessarily changed the meaning of both earth and motion. So, but of course, as I said, this framework of reference are not only something that influences the understanding of two theories embedded in different cultures. They can also occur in one and the same culture, as we have seen. But of course, we have to admit that the more two cultures are apart from one another historically, the longer they have, the two areas have been developed in mutual isolations, and the more their languages regarding the grammatical structures they use are different, the more of their axiological systems are different, patterns of thinking, and so on. The larger is the possibility that the referential framework into which their theories are embedded are also very different. So theories that have been historically developed in different socio-political traditions and linguistic areas also produce different referential frameworks, which are, on the other hand, linked to different methodologies applied in the process of perceiving, understanding, and interpreting reality. A referential framework in this sense can be defined as a relational structure of concepts, categories, terms, and ideas which are applied in the cognitive processing of the objects of comprehension. It also includes paradigms and perspectives that influence and define the comprehension and evaluation of particular semantic elements within this structure, and of course also the structure of this dynamic network as a whole. In other words, it defines every concept applied in the theory and determines its specific connotations. And in the same way, it defines the relations between concrete notions as well as the entire network of these relations as such. So if we start here from the assumption that using different languages and different patterns of thought associated with their individual grammatical structures, different cultures continuously create different frames of reference that assume an influential role in human understanding and interpretation of a given reality. So frames of reference are comprehensive instruments that filter perceptions and create meanings. Different reference frames can lead to different descriptions and interpretations of the one and the same objective reality, of course. So, but what I have to really highlight in this context is the fact that different frames of reference do not imply the fact that they exist. This fact does not imply that we cannot understand each other. On the contrary, for instance, the aforementioned analytical philosopher Professor Peng Yaoming, who has also written about this, he called them frameworks of premises. And he said that if two frameworks of premises are too different from one another, such as most of the Chinese philosophies and the dominant Western philosophies, then these philosophies are actually incommensurable, and we cannot really compare them with one another. I must say that I strongly disagree with this idea. Of course, I think we are all human beings. Our brain is structured in a completely same way, no matter where we grow up or what kind of language we speak or how we think about certain things. We perceive reality in a completely the same way, but we might describe them in different ways. So I think that as human beings, our similarities by far outweigh the differences that separate us, and every human being can communicate and can understand each other, no matter in what culture they have been living. But so I don't see these different frameworks of reference as something that blocks our mutual understanding. On the contrary, I see referential frameworks as something that can bring us together, in the sense that it can provide us better tools for understanding. But the condition is, of course, that we master the basic structure, at least, of these referential frameworks. So the knowledge of the specific frames of reference that has emerged in the historical development of Chinese philosophy is of utmost importance in order to interpret certain concepts and to transfer them from one from this context into the framework of global philosophy, so that they can be understood. In this context, the methods of discursive translations, or what I call discursive translation, are a very good tool. Of course, as we all know, translations are necessarily also interpretations of the multiple connotations of concepts and categories embedded in different semantic and referential networks. Moreover, translations of different logical systems that belong to different semantic frameworks, different linguistic structures, and different methodological paradigms, and so on, can never be limited to merely translating one language into another in a literary way. So they must also involve translation or transposition of different concepts and evaluation criteria that differ according to the corresponding socio-cultural context. So, and on this basis, we can now start to tackle the question of intercultural or transcultural comparison, because the problem of transferring meanings goes further, and it also concerns the very concept of philosophical comparisons. So the very concept of comparison as such is already problematic, and it gets more problematic when we are dealing with philosophies, ideas, systems, philosophers, and so on, who belong to different cultures and write in different languages and so on. So many scholars see the main problem of such unreflected comparisons in the fact that we use a unifying methodology and one single philosophical language, and then we apply them on culturally discrete and different materials. So, but in my view, the core problem goes much deeper and is much more complex, because the methodology in question and the philosophical language in question is a system that underlies one of the philosophies under comparisons, namely, mostly the Western one. When I say a unified philosophical language, I of course don't speak only about a language of about its terminology. This also implies the categorical apparatuses, the concepts, the laws of thinking, and so on. All this is what constitutes one philosophical language. And so if we use one methodology, one unified methodology, and one unified philosophical language, which is when we compare Western and Chinese or Japanese philosophy, and this methodology is part of the Western philosophy, then of course Chinese philosophy is in an unequal position, simply put. So we could say that the tertium comparationis, that with what we actually, or by what we compare, is part of the two comparanta under observation. And why is that so? Of course, we all know that East Asia and China, that they are not some backwards, underdeveloped regions anymore, like they were 100 or 200 years ago, that they are close to being superpowers already. At least Europe can hide itself for the glorious image of Eastern Asia. But these axiological criteria and the methodologies applied in science are still Western. And this is connected to the fact, of course, that the modernization which underlies today's globalization, that this modernization was, of course, imported to the whole world from Europe. It was a product of the Industrial Revolution. And this is also, and because this kind of Western modernization is something that underlies the today globalized world and the relations in this world. This means that it is no coincidence that these axiological criteria, that these methodologies, all these norms and standards which guide our comparison are still coming more or less from Western philosophies. So, based on the reflection and analysis of such issues that are inherent actually in traditional comparative procedures, many scholars have tried to create, have been elaborated upon new methodological tools that could overcome such problems or such problematic approaches. So this kind of experimentalisms and new models of transcultural philosophizing have been termed post-comparative philosophy. So this term post-comparative philosophy is mostly, again, used by such scholars who think that these are these new approaches that have been built on the awareness of these problems inherent in traditional comparisons. But I must say that some scholars also use the term post-comparative in a different way. Ralph Weber, for instance, a German sinologist, applies it in a way that for him post-comparison is part of his model of comparisons. Okay, but this is not so important. In other words, post-comparative approaches are based upon procedures of conceptual comparing rather than merely comparing concepts. And this challenging idea is based upon a self-critical account of comparative philosophy that has, of course, been long overdue already. And as I have mentioned, there have been many different methods created in this framework, and I think that we can all learn a lot about these methods, but each method, of course, also has its insufficiency. And in the last few months, there were two methods that were really very often discussed, and this is the method of the so-called philosophical fusion or philosophy of fusion, where two philosophies from different cultures are being fused together, and the philosophy of synthesis, respectively. So, but I think that just a few words to both of these methods before we come to the sublation approach. I think that the very notion of fusion seems to be a rather unlucky terminological choice, because it refers to the process or result of joining two or more things together to form a single entity. It is often even associated with the process of melting, which normally results in a unity in which particular elements of the two or more entities that have been melted or fused together become completely unrecognizable, and they're essentially alienated. So the amalgamated unity, which arises through a fusion, is of course a qualitatively new substance. Now, if we consider fusion as a metaphor for a certain mode of philosophical reasoning, then we have to admit that new philosophical insights are always based upon some previous cognitive substances. So genuine philosophizing is a creative process, and this is of course, the goal of the fusion method, can hardly be based upon an amalgamated unity of distorted elements. So, because it must be based, such thinking must be based upon certain discrete philosophical grounds. And now let's turn our attention to the second method I would like to introduce. So we could consider the synthesis philosophy. Synthesis is, of course, also an interesting concept. It is because it refers to a qualitatively new stage of development, and one in which some elements of the two or more entities from which it arises are preserved and others discarded. But precisely in philosophy, the term synthesis is often overburdened with the orthodox Hegelian view, in which synthesis is a result of two reciprocally excluding and mutually contradictive entities, while comparison can include both distinctions and commonalities of the comparanta, of the objects we compare. So an additional and perhaps even more severe problem arises when we consider the mechanistic nature of such dialectical processes of which synthesis is a part, which seem to develop through and by themselves and to proceed more or less automatically from one stage to another. Thus, a synthesis philosophy would probably mostly be seen as something that fails to provide space for new conceptions created by individual minds, unless we are the absolute spirit, but most of us aren't. So, and on this basis, I would now like to briefly introduce this new approach, which I tentatively call philosophy, transcultural philosophy of sublation, or even more complicated, we can call it transcultural philosophical transcultural philosophy of post-comparative sublation, or something like that. We can make it even more complicated, sound even more complicated if we want. But so within the framework of such culturally and conceptually sensitive approaches, because fusion philosophy and synthesis philosophy are culturally sensitive. They have been elaborated upon against the background of these problems of culturally unsensitive approaches. So I propose a new method for transferring meanings from Chinese to global philosophy. And as I said, I call it sublation. It is, of course, work in progress. It is still work in progress. It is still being improved with every new research I make, and also with every new discussion I'm having with my diverse audiences. So I'm sure today it is going to be improved a lot. So although the term sublation also forms a part of Hegelian lines of thought and could hence be seen as problematic, especially in regard to transculture, to philosophies of different cultures, but the term, the notion of sublation, or the concept of the approach of sublation, does not function in the same way as in Hegel. Of course, as many of you probably know, the term sublation is a neologism. It was actually coined by the translators, who have translated the German Hegelian term Aufhebung into English. And they were looking for a term that could cover all three basic connotations that are implied in the notion of German Aufhebung. And these three connotations are, of course, of crucial importance for any process of creating something new from interactions between two or more different objects of phenomena. And in this philosophical sense, the term Aufhebung has these three connotations of eliminating, preserving, and arising to a higher level. So, so these translators looked for a word with the same or similar meaning, and they found it in Latin. The verb sublatio has all these three connotations, so they have somehow transferred it into English and made a noun out of this verb, and so that was sublation. And I also like this term because I think it is important also for the, it can describe somehow the approach that I am developing at the moment. And what is also nice with this notion of sublation, idea of sublation, is the fact that in contrast to synthesis or fusion, the notion of sublation refers to a process rather than a fixed stage. And what I'm looking for is, of course, also a dynamic model for comparing or juxtaposing different philosophies. So this approach is not only about identifying differences and similarities between two or more philosophical discourses. With this method, certain aspects derived from philosophies of different cultures can be used contrastively only as inspirations for our own philosophizing. There is no right or wrong one, it is an inspiration. So in this sense, the tension between those contrastive aspects of philosophical perception and interpretation of reality can help us raise our idea to a new level and to provide us a new insight by preserving certain elements of both aspects and eliminating others which are not useful, and also eliminating this this opposition between the two comparanta, between the two philosophies or ideas under observation. In this way, it is also possible to transcend the static notions of cultures in which philosophies under comparisons are embedded. So, of course, and now it would be time to demonstrate, because as I said, I apologize for this boring theoretical nature of this talk, and it would be much nicer if I could have a chance to demonstrate the method on a certain concrete example, but it is really difficult to demonstrate it in an hour or so, and that's why I will only tell you some examples where I have been applying these methods already. I have applied it, and most of these examples are published in form of different articles. I have applied the method by comparing or contrastively analyzing Zeno of Elea and Huyshe regarding the problem of the flying arrow and the question whether it moves or not. I applied it by comparing Kant and Marx and showing actually that Lizarrault was using a very similar method without knowing it when he created his theory of transformation of the empirical into the transcendental. Then I used it also in comparing Adorno and Lizarrault and their respective views on the relation between concepts and objects. And then Adorno and Gungsunlung, which was quite difficult because these two philosophers are really very far apart, not only geopolitically and historically, but also historically, and also regarding the referential frameworks with which they have been working. And now at the moment I'm trying to apply the method on a comparison between Sant Augustino and Mozart regarding the question of the relation of time and reality, between time and reality. And then Jang Dong-sun and Russell, who have both created a system of structural epistemology, but these two systems are quite different from one another. And this comparison, I hope, could bring us closer a step on regarding the question how we human beings actually how we perceive, how we feel, perceive, interpret, communicate reality. So, and because I don't have time to introduce one of these examples more in detail, I can still try just to explain to you how this sublation process is working, is functioning. So we proceed from a philosophical question, from a conceptual question that is intriguing for us, that for which we on which we are interested, in which we are interested, and that has been elaborated upon by two systems or two ideas or two philosophers, and then it consists this contrastive analysis or this comparison consists or proceeds with six different steps. First, the first step is that we identify the similarities. What are the similarities in the elaboration, in the tackling of this question by both philosophers? How is their view of this question? In which aspects it is similar or the same? Then the next step is that we identify the differences within these similarities, not differences in general, but we look at this, here they're similar and here they say the same thing. But if we look closer, we can identify differences within these similarities, and then we can also relate these differences. If we ask ourselves, how is it possible that they say the same thing, but they mean something else? We relate these differences to the different referential frameworks of the two theories in which these two theories we are working with are embedded. Then in the next step, which also always makes me feel so embarrassed, it is really embarrassing. We identified the inconsistencies or insufficiencies or failures that we can find in this views of these two comparanta, and it is always so embarrassing. For instance, when I have to look at some inconsistencies in Adorno or Kant, and then I always ask myself, who am I to criticize Kant or Marx? But well, we are all human beings, also included Kant and Adorno and all these people. So we identify these inconsistencies, and this is actually a very productive stage, because on the basis of these inconsistencies, we can look how these two comparanta can complement each other, how they can help each other to overcome these inconsistencies or insufficiencies. So in the out of this complementarity, actually, the tension that is provided by this complementarity, we can that there can be a shift which makes which allows our thought to observe, to find some new aspects in this basic question we were tackling actually through this contrastive analysis. So, and this is what I call sublation. It is a kind of shift. We have this complementary dialectics, which leads us to new insight into something. But this new insight, of course, is also dynamic, and it is important that it remains open for even more new insights and so on. So in this way, we can come to a new idea or a new proposition regarding this basic philosophical question. And if we succeed with this procedure, it is not always the case, but if we succeed, then we feel satisfaction. Okay, so I hope that with this somehow partly boring and too theoretical introduction, I have still succeeded to make you understand how this work in process of the so-called sublation method is functioning. So the main thing is also that the similarities identified went beyond the boundaries of the respective cultural context in which they originally developed, but because the identification of the differences did not proceed from the search from differences in the cultural backgrounds as such, but from different paradigms determined by the two frames of reference in which the respective theories or ideas were developed. So in this way, it is possible to overcome the static notions of cultures in which the philosophies being compared were embedded. So in other words, the sublation method can help us to overcome the time and space that determine certain notions shaped by different cultural discourses. And in this way, when speaking of time and space, I think that my time in this virtual space for this lecture is also over. I don't see most of you, but I hope you were not falling asleep, and there are still some people who can who could follow this lecture till the end. But I would, of course, like to thank you for your patient listening, and I will now open the floor for your comments, for your questions, for your constructive critiques, which will hopefully improve this method I'm working on. So thank you very much again, and let's discuss.
Thank you very much, Jana, for this highly interesting and I would say inspiring lecture. So as we said, we have two commentators to your lecture, and please let me introduce our first commentator, who is Dr. Anne Peng White, who is a professor of philosophy and director of Asian Studies at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania, and the executive director of the International Society for Chinese Philosophy. She obtained her PhD degree in philosophy from Marquette University. Her research interests include Chinese philosophy, medieval philosophy, comparative philosophy, ethics, philosophy of women and social political philosophy. Professor Peng White is a member of several editorial boards of academic presses and journals. She has authored more than 40 journal articles, book chapters, and book reviews, and has published 3 books, namely The Confucian 4 Books for Women by Oxford University Press in 2018, and the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Chinese Philosophy and Gender, and regarding readings in Chinese women's philosophical and feminist thought from the late 13th to early 21st century, both published by Bloomsbury, the last one just 2 months ago, right? So recently she has served as the guest editor and organizer of the special issue Philosophy, Women and Gender in the New Millennium for the Journal of Chinese Philosophy, and as the guest editor for a forthcoming special issue, Self and Other, for National Taiwan University's NTU Philosophical Quarterly, which will come out this month, I think, correct? So Professor Peng White, I kindly ask you for your comments.
Okay. Thank you, Tia, for the wonderful introduction here. I don't have a PowerPoint.
Doesn't matter.
I will just talk about my thoughts here. So first of all, I want to thank Professor Jana Rošker's very enlightening and thoughtful presentation. I think the method of sublation in comparison to the method of fusion or synthesis is very interesting, especially the method of sublation preserves, in my understanding, the uniqueness of each compared system while looking for fruitful differences and commonality while considering the respective referential framework of the systems that are being compared. I read your book, particularly the last chapter, chapter 4, and the epilogue there. And I really appreciate your analysis and comparison of Li Zehou with Kant and Marx. And I think the method of sublation helped me to go beyond superficial similarity and pay attention to the nuanced contrasting features derived from their very different referential framework. So I have three questions, and I know because of time constraint here, you may not be able to answer all of them. So just pick whichever one you feel you would like to choose to answer. Okay, I'm just raising 3 questions. And I raise this question because I hope to learn more from Professor Rošker's very dedicated work for decades in sinology and Chinese philosophy. Okay, so my first question is, some scholars have proposed doing transcultural comparative philosophy by a method of analogy or by metaphor. So I wonder whether you could speak a little bit more. Insofar in your view, how does the method of sublation differs from or improve on the method of analogy? Because in the 6 steps, you mentioned about similarity, differences, etc. So that just making me recall some scholars propose a method of analogy seem to at least take the first few steps you proposed in the 6 steps. So I wonder whether you can speak about that more. Second question I have is, I also share very deeply the similar concern Professor Rošker raised regarding the asymmetry exchange of scholarship and the transcultural, cross-cultural learning between the West and the East. And so I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about how the method, transcultural philosophical method of sublation, can help us to correct the mostly unidirectional import of Western scholarship, or you mentioned, for example, translation of Western work readily into Chinese, but not vice versa. So I wonder whether you can speak a little bit about that. How does the method of sublation could help us to correct that problem? The third question I have is, I wonder whether Professor Rošker can say a little bit more. I think this is in the epilogue of your book. And so I'm very interested in this. So I wonder whether you have time to also speak a little bit more about this. That is, you mentioned that the transcultural philosophy and the method of sublation in your PowerPoint presentation too, you mentioned it's a post-comparative philosophy. And in the epilogue of your book, you mentioned that this would require, for example, if I read it correctly, the new intercultural philosophical vocabularies or an alien semantic, which you cite Ames and Moeller. So I wonder whether you could share a little bit more what you mean by that, and have you give a little bit more thought about examples to show us the kind of new intercultural philosophical vocabulary or alien semantics? Thank you. That's my humble question here.
Yes, I would also like to thank you for your kind remarks and comment. I, of course, also hope to learn a lot from you and from your works, and also your comments. Some of them were also quite inspiring. So I'm still thinking about them. But let's proceed, because we have other comments also to the first question. It is a very good question, namely about where do I place this method of analogies? Because I was working a lot in recent years, in previous years, on the method of analogies, although I think it has also several flaws. I think that the first flaw is that if we apply the term analogy, it can lead us again to severe misunderstandings, because I think that the analogy which arises from Chinese logic is something quite different than analogy in Western philosophy, because the analogy in Western philosophy is dealing with comparing actually how do you say, relations between, for instance, the relation between A and B, how does it compare to the relation between C and D, whether the relations whether the analogies in Chinese philosophy are mainly occupied to find similarities between objects. And I think this is still somehow to a certain extent visible in modern Chinese theoretical discourses, because most of them, I remember my dear teacher from Nankai University, Professor Cui Qingtian, who was an expert in Chinese logic. I have learned, I'm very grateful to him, because I have really learned a lot in every aspect from him. But and he was an expert, a very good expert in researching Chinese logic, and he was working a lot on this Tui Lei, the Chinese type of analogy, and he was always highlighting that when we compare, Chinese and Western philosophies, we should not look for differences, but we should look for similarities more. And I think why this is so appealing for many Chinese scholars is the fact, because it has something to do with harmony. Let's let's don't look for conflicts. Let's look for reconciliation, for similarities. And this is somehow this axiological background that is behind this comparison of similarities. And I think based on similarities, I think that the method of sublation, at least that's how I have constructed it, the similarities are only the first step, really only the first step, because what is even more important in this, what is even more important in this regard are the differences within these similarities. Because first you identify the similarities, and then you can show, well, these similarities are only similar on the first glimpse. They are, in fact, they are not similar at all. This happens very, very often, I would say. But this is also the most creative and the most constructive moment of the whole method, I think. I think we cannot, I mean, in spite of all my deep gratitude and respect for my Chinese teachers also, and also respect for the notion of harmony. And as I said in my lecture, I also think that we are not incommensurable. We can understand each other, and we will, I mean, these whole new methods, many new methods of comparative philosophy, they all are seeking for to improve our mutual understandings, right? But I think in this search for improving our mutual understanding, we should not proceed from a basis that we are only seeking for similarities and ignoring our differences, because I don't think this is not a good way for living in a partnership, even, and it is also not a good way to doing comparative philosophy. So I think that the method of sublation, as I see it, would somehow try to surpass, not to ignore or neglect, but to surpass the mere question of similarities, while the method of analogy is actually based on investigating these similarities. So that is for the first question. The second question, which regards the symmetry, we have both written a lot about, and we are not the only scholars of Chinese Western philosophies who have written about it and who are really concerned about this asymmetry. I think that it is, of course, if you want to overcome this asymmetry and to make a more balanced approach to different philosophies in the global framework, of course, it is not as easy as it seems at the first glimpse. We cannot just say, well, now we will decide to eliminate this asymmetry and to create a balanced approach, and then because these are questions that are connected on a deeper level, of course, also with political and economic issues like colonialism, and these are issues that cannot be resolved on a conceptual level alone. But on the other hand, of course, we all live in a globalized world, and because we live in a globalized world, I think that that all the crises we face, all the most dangerous crises we face, like ecological disasters, global warming, wars, aggressive wars, unequal distribution of sources and wealth. All these crises are also, of course, somehow connected to the global conditions, and they cannot be addressed or resolved in the borders of our separate nation states. So we need such a kind of a cultural intercultural, transcultural dialogue more than ever before. And now, if I try, of course, I would like to see that the sublation methods could solve all these questions, all these problems, but of course it cannot. But I think a good step forward to our mutual understanding is really that we take, if we manage to take into consideration these differences in referential frameworks, because they are based on certain paradigms that have to be recognized before, if we really want to talk to each other without being misunderstood all the time. And I think that, East Asian area, China was forced to collect this transcultural knowledge in the process of colonialization. She was forced to do all these translations. And vice versa, it is not like that. If I talk to this urgent necessity to my colleagues that are only trained in Western philosophy, mostly they still don't see it. They don't see this urgent need. And they still, to a great extent, many of them have still a very arrogant attitude towards us, and they said, well, look at China, how it looks now, and why should we learn anything from China? We are so much better. So it is also, connected with these deep-seated biases that won't go away from today to tomorrow. And another question that is really important in this regard is that it is much easier, I think, for Chinese people to understand and to translate Western works than vice versa. Well, I know this sounds somehow provocative and maybe stupid, but I have good reasons for thinking so, because I think that really Western philosophy is based on this static framework of which is rooted in the three basic laws of formal logic: law of identity, law of exclusion, law of difference, non-identity, and the law of the excluded middle or the excluded third, tertium non datur. And this is what prevailed in the development, and it is and this is what we are as Westerners accustomed, how we see the world. We see it as a very somehow static reality, and that's why I think this is the main reason why Western philosophers have so much difficulties to understand Chinese philosophy, because it is based on dynamic principles of change. So so it often doesn't make sense. It is not valid in these three, in this framework of formal logic. So a static framework can never incorporate a dynamic framework, but vice versa, it is possible. People who are used to think in a dynamic framework, they can incorporate static laws of thinking in much easier than the other way around. So this is, I'm sorry, I was talking for so long and I didn't provide any solution to this complex but very urgent problem. But I think with discussions like that, we are still coming closer to that common goal of us. So thank you very much. Regarding the third question, I think I will spare it maybe for our next discussion in June, because otherwise I will be talking too long, because we still have Professor Foust. Thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. So let me briefly introduce our second commentator, who is Dr. Mathew Foust, is a professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Appalachian State University. His research draws primarily on ancient Chinese philosophy and classical American philosophy, with an abiding interest in historical and comparative areas of intersection between these two traditions. His work in ethics focuses largely on the virtue of loyalty, with several publications offering interpretations and applications of Josiah Royce's philosophy of loyalty. His work in philosophy of religion includes examination of philosophical and religious perspectives on death and immorality. He's currently the vice president of the Jesuit. Pardon?
Was it immorality or immortality?
Yeah, I constantly want to say immorality. Of course, it's immortality. I'm sorry. I don't know why. I have to ponder on it. So he is currently the vice president of the Josiah Royce Society and secretary of the International Society for Chinese Philosophy, and a past secretary treasurer of the International Society for Comparative Studies of Chinese and Western Philosophy. So Professor Foust, we are eager to hear your comments on the lecture, please.
Okay, thank you so much for your introduction, Thea. And I do have a short PowerPoint, so just now I'll try to share it.
Mhm.
We see it.
All right. Yeah,
Yeah.
wonderful. So thank you, Jana, for your compelling work. I have enjoyed it and learned very much from reading your recent articles and book. Your approach to comparative philosophy is insightful, and I appreciate the quality of scholarship supporting it. Considering my own work in light of yours, I believe I have unwittingly employed the method of sublation in some chapters of my book, Confucianism and American Philosophy. For example, in the chapter Confucianism and James, Human Nature and Morality, I analyze William James's disparate comments on human nature from contrasting points of view, namely the paradigms of human nature found in Mencius and Schunze, taking into account their respective frames of reference in order to achieve a new perspective into James's thought about human nature and morality. Here I turn a common methodological paradigm upside down on its head. Rather than rely on a Western framework to clarify ideas from Eastern sources, I draw on ancient Chinese philosophers to demystify the thought of a 20th century American philosopher. I do not assume that you are familiar with my work, but as a first question for you, do you regard this sort of inverting of methodological paradigms as consistent with the method of sublation? As I have read your work, I have also been reminded of the work of a past participant of the collaborative learning series, Tim Connolly's Doing Philosophy Comparatively, published in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
In this book, Connolly identifies 4 methods of comparative analysis, what he calls universalism, pluralism, consensus, and global philosophy. Your favored method of sublation appears to feature elements of each of these 4 methods.
Mm-hmm.
And when I describe your method of sublation, I will refer to 5 steps rather than 6, as you referred to today. I've derived my count of 5 from the flying arrow problem article. In this case, today's steps 3 and 4 are joined together, fused into step 3 in my PowerPoint. Okay, so as you describe it, the first step of the method of sublation is to identify similarities of the 2 comparanda. Connolly describes the universalist method of comparison as that method which emphasizes points of convergence between different philosophical cultural traditions. Okay. The second step of the method of sublation is to identify differences between the 2 comparanda by considering the main paradigms of the respective frames of reference to which they belong. And Connolly describes the pluralist method as that method which emphasizes points of divergence between different philosophical cultural traditions. The third step of the method of sublation is to engage in the dialectic of eliminating and preserving. Connolly describes the consensus method as combining elements of universalism and pluralism, establishing a set of norms shared by multiple traditions, while at the same time allowing for diversity of acceptable philosophical norms. Similar to, as you said today, finding the differences within the similarities, and I suppose finding similarities within the differences. The third step, just said that. The fourth step of the method of sublation is a cognitive shift instigated by the foregoing three steps, leading to the fifth step, the new insight manifesting itself in one or more new ideas, propositions, or theses. Connolly describes the global philosophical approach as a variety of what the philosopher of social science Brian Fay calls interactionism, in which the comparanda are likened to two spirals ascending upward with various points of contact with one another, making for a dynamic commingling in which parties constantly change. The mutual exchange of comparanda has the potential to enrich the traditions themselves and to advance philosophical dialogue in general. I think it's plausible to interpret the method of sublation as a form of the global philosophical method or interactionist method of comparative philosophy. You remark of the sublation method that it can help us overcome the time and space that determine certain notions shaped by different cultural discourses. Likewise, according to Connolly, these exchanges can be both creative and destructive. In some cases, both cultural traditions may learn from another, while in others, one may be forced to give up ways of thinking that have long been part of it. I hope that my highlighting the affinity between your work and that of Connolly is helpful. In my teaching from his book, I have found students largely persuaded that comparative philosophy is a worthwhile enterprise, and any method that not just allows for, but invites points of contact between comparanda to affect change in the philosophical theories and paradigms at play is exciting. At the same time, some remain skeptical and believe that the search for truth is needlessly distracted by attending to the cultural contexts from which philosophical concepts, theories, and paradigms arise. So my second question then is, do you encounter this challenge in the classroom or otherwise, and how do you address it? In closing, I would like to emphasize that it is a pleasure to participate in this conversation and celebration of your interesting and important work. Thank you again, as well as to Paul for extending the invitation, and to all participants in attendance today.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So, Jana, would you like to respond to the comment?
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Faust for his insightful comments. I must confess that I'm not yet familiar with your work, but what you said, what you described, how you described it, I'm very much intrigued, and I will be familiar, at least with the book, until our next discussion, so we can discuss on a more comprehensive level. And now, regarding, and I'm really very, very happy to hear that maybe you or Tim Connolly, whose book about comparative philosophy I have, of course, read, but that was years ago already, that you are thinking in similar directions. Although I think when I read Tim Connolly's book, I was very much inspired, but it also, like the sublation in my own work, it remained more or less on a theoretical level. So I think that theory is one thing. It is important, at least for some scholars. For me individually, it is important because I like to have a concept with which I'm working when I'm working concretely. So I thought all his different suggestions about how doing the comparative philosophy, I thought they were very inspirational propositions, and I don't see any of them actual in contradiction with the sublation method. And the same applies to your idea of inverting paradigms. I think it is very, very well compatible with the method of sublation, because you see, this method is not something I own. It is not my private property. On the contrary, I want you guys to help improving it, to develop it, and so on. And it is very important for me that it really remains always an open method. And this would also be the case with these inverting paradigms. It is one step. Then the problem, why was in your, or in my book perhaps, in my book which was published in 21, this is years ago already. So the sublation method has made some steps forward in the meantime. And this is also the reason why you were talking about these 5 steps and I was talking about 6 steps, because the method has developed in the meantime. I think that it is still, because it is still a work in progress, it may end up with 7 or 8 steps or be reduced to 4 steps. I don't really know, but I would be very happy if other scholars like you, who are also likewise interested in this question, could help developing it. Then, because there is certain an affinity in the ways we are thinking. Now, your second question was I think about, could you just repeat it?
Sure. Just some
because the PowerPoint has the PowerPoint is not, yeah.
Some individuals may be skeptical or critical about the wish to consider cultural context as even relevant. Some may, for example, think they want to know the nature of knowledge and its justified true belief, and they don't need to look at cultural context. Yeah. So how will you reply to that skeptic?
Yeah, there are many people like that think that it is that still think that it is completely irrelevant, because we have philosophy is one philosophy, methodology is one methodology, and this is the only approach that can lead us to the truth. But my problem is now that I don't believe into this concept of truth. What is truth? Truth is not only something which does not exist in this form in Chinese philosophy, but objectively I'm an unbeliever in the truth. But I must say that I encounter such debates very often when I'm debating with scholars outside of my department, actually, because my department is the Department for Asian Studies, of course, and my students, most of them would not be there if they would think that something like culture is irrelevant in cognitive processes or in mutual dialogue. So I think that confrontations with this kind of people, I think the being skeptic is always good. And but I don't understand how you can be skeptic on one hand and on the other hand, still believe in a certain absolute truth which cannot be questioned skeptically. So, but I am even in this kind of discussions with these truth believers who are skeptical to everything that is not the truth. Even in such discussions, I think we should remain constructive and try just to present our ideas in a way that won't be offensive for anybody, and maybe also inspirational for other people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And to you, Anne.
Thank you to both of you, to three of you, to four of you, actually, Paul. So we are slowly approaching to the end, right, of this beautiful event of philosophizing. But still, I would like to invite the audience. Maybe there are some questions pondering in your mind, and we would like to present it or pose a question to Professor Jana Rošker. So I will also check the chat, but there are no questions there yet.
There is one.
There is one. Please.
Oh no, it's just thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your kind words.
I have a question.
Yeah.
If it's okay.
Okay, we hear you.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it and thought it was fascinating. I'm currently a graduate student, kind of struggling to do a dissertation that's comparative. And I think when I got into it, I didn't realize some of these challenges that I was going to face. And so all of this work, of course, speaks directly to some of these things that I'm thinking about. I had one specific question about a part in the process which you laid out. And that was just about the first step where you start to look at similarities. And so I think where I'm getting stuck in my project is just this. So it seems like oftentimes when you went through this process of sublimation, you were taking one philosopher and comparing another philosopher, an Eastern philosopher and then a Western philosopher. But the way that I seem to be framing my project right now is to take part of the Western referential framework itself and then look at a particular Chinese philosopher. And I don't know if this is maybe wrong-headed or I need to narrow my scope down, but I guess my question is just this, like when you look at this process of sublimation, for instance, if I was to think about Xunzi and I'm trying to think about, you know, the dichotomizing in the West between realism and anti-realism, you know, is that like an illegitimate way to frame the project? I mean, would you say I should actually look at a particular philosopher in the West who has this view, or just is it always like philosopher to philosopher, or could you do philosopher to conceptual framework itself? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this inspiring question. I think the sublative method is not at all limited to comparing two. In fact, it does never compare two philosophers in their philosophies as such. It always proceeds from a philosophical research question, and then in the next step, it looks how two or three or philosophers look to it, or how it is tackled, this question or another question, by systems also. I mean, you can juxtapose. It is somehow the method is somehow not a traditional comparison, but it is more like you know, I would like to call it contrastive analysis, but I cannot call it contrastive analysis because this is a term that means something completely else in linguistic again. But it is about this that you proceed from a question. You don't proceed from philosophers or from ideas that are being articulated by these philosophers, and it can work on one single idea, like I did with this Zenon and Huiza, sorry, about the flying arrow. This is only one idea, but it can also be compared. It can also contain comparisons between systems, like what I'm working now, for instance, is a whole system of structural epistemology and how these two systems differ. So it is always, you always have to proceed from the research question and not from the philosophers you want to compare. You cannot squeeze some philosophers or their opinions into the metrics of this method. That would make it too limited, I think, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
That helps a lot. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you to both of you. We have 2 to 3 questions still in the chat, and I would like to ask Mercedes, right?
Hey.
She was the first one. So please, Mercedes.
I was fast. Thank you, Jana, so much for this lecture. I have enjoyed it very much. And I have a lot of thoughts, which I'm not going to share all of them because there is no time. I want to edit myself. But I'm very interested in these topics. So I have been thinking, let me just share a few ideas. So the first question, more directly related to your proposal of the sublation method, would be, how can we avoid with this method of yours to the reification of the frame of reference or that paradigm in Kuhn's terms, right? Because this frame of reference that we are talking about is nothing more than concrete relations that happen in a particular time in a particular way, right? And then they're always shifting, as you have been emphasizing, right? About dynamism and not wanting to be static. But whenever that we take that concept and we say, oh, this is the frame of reference, or this is a paradigm wherein I'm going to understand this concept and that concept, we're already immediately making it static, and it's kind of unavoidable. And I don't know even if it's something that we should avoid, as long as we are aware of our conceptual tools have that kind of power. That's what they do, right? We have to reify something in order to make it usable for this purpose, for this time, right? But I don't know, I'm not completely sure. So maybe you have an idea of whether that can be completely overcome and how, right? Or whether it's and why it should be overcome. And then another thought I was having with fusion, because you were saying with fusion, it's like merging together so that the different elements, the composing elements, lose their individuality and their frame of reference, right? So they lose their identity in a way, and we don't want that, right? Or maybe some people don't want that, right? But I don't know, I was thinking about fusion cuisine, right? Which is what that term always brings me to cooking. And what you want there is to be able to take elements from different cultures, frames of references, and harmonize them in a way that in their relation, they become something different and they have a different impact on your palate in this way, in this case, right? But they don't lose their individuality, and actually you still want them to be noticeable where they come from or what they are, but just that you are using them, you're making new relations that bring a new side out of them. So that for me is a perfect metaphor of how we want to do this post-comparative philosophy, right? So again, a question for you of whether the sublation method is better at doing that than the fusion method, in particular examples, you know, these things. And also the final thought, very briefly, because you are interested in process as opposed to the final static result. I'm wondering whether you have read Jane Bennett's Influx and Efflux. I'll send you the reference. Anyway, so she talks about in any kind of process of interaction. So this influx is like getting in and efflux is like breathing out. So we're always incorporating alien elements and making them part of our own. So until they are not alien anymore, but now we consider them ourselves, and then we put them out there in this efflux process, right? And then again, they become something different, and they will become assimilated by yet another creature, living being, person, in a different way, right? So everything is a constant process of translation, right? And that's, I think that's the most important insight of all these post or trans methods, which is understanding that by the time that we come to the step in which we want to compare, intentionally compare, we're already part of the comparison, right? And we have been throughout because we can't step out of our own minds, right?
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mercedes. And by the way, it's so nice seeing you again, although only online. Yes, of course. Thank you first for describing so well this notion of process, which is in the center actually of my endeavors. Also, it is precisely like you give something, you get something, and then something new comes out of it in a very briefly way. And regarding the process of fusion, method of fusion, of course, as I said, the method of fusion, method of conflation, method of synthesis, these are many new methods which are being developed on the basis that we are all somehow unsatisfied with the current state or with the traditional state of comparison. However, I was reading some, and please send me this reference to the book about the process. Yeah, but I was reading some critiques of the fusion method from other scholars who were not actually scholars of Chinese philosophy, but I think who were also dealing with these intercultural comparisons. And one of the main arguments against this method of fusion was, it is like this fusion in cooking. It is terrible. So one can of course have different opinions about the fusion in comparative philosophy, as one can have different opinions in fusion of cooking. But I think that both can be made in a good or in a bad way, and this is what counts. I wouldn't say I'm against the fusion cooking or I'm against the fusion method in comparative philosophy. It depends how it is made, right? And the same, I think, also the same applies for the method of sublation. I would also like to highlight here that, it is, I'm not presenting this method as something, or this approach as something, well, you all should be using it now because it is so good, or it will be even better when I improve it further. No, I think that it is also, it has to do also very individually how people like to work in research or in composing some theories. It is a method that suits me regarding my individual personality or how I do research, but it is not something for everybody. Yeah, I would like to highlight that maybe some other methods are more suitable for other people. But I just wanted to share it because it helps me thinking and developing my thoughts. And then regarding the first question about these frames of reference, I think that frames of reference, of course, they are, as I said, these semantic relational networks that are very dynamic and changeable, and all these relations change, and the objects within are also changing all the time. But then you said, yeah, but if you use these frameworks in a certain stage of the sublation method, then it becomes somehow static, right? And I just have two ideas regarding this comment. First of all, I think that this one can study frameworks, a particular framework of reference, and identify then certain paradigms that influence it all the time. And these paradigms are, I wouldn't say static, but such that their function as concepts. For instance, the basic features, some of the basic features of the Chinese, of the framework of Chinese philosophy is first that they that it is dynamic, Yijing embedded in this continuous change, then that they are holistic, that they work with different, that they work in the framework of what Litzehout says it's the one world theory, or what the modern Confucians like Mo Zong-san call the immanent transcendence, or immanence, transcendence in immanence. And then they work with, not with dualisms, but with binary categories and so on. So when I use this sublation method, I don't look at how two objects are related in this static frame of time and space, but I look at the why is this, how is this difference actually connected to these basic features or basic characteristics that define a certain framework. And the other idea I have here is simply the idea that I already said, that dynamic entities always also contain static moments. So this is not really a contradiction for me. And we will talk more about it in May. I hope so.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question from Andrew Lambert. Andrew, are you still with us?
I think Vit is.
Can you
Yeah,
hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Andy. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Jana, I promise you that paper's coming. So
I'm still waiting, yeah.
Thank you for an excellent talk, and particularly for a really nice distillation of a certain method, which I think is a really appealing approach. I wanted to ask a sort of devil's advocate question. First, a general question, which you've partly answered, but I thought it might be helpful to follow through with it. Do you see yourself as presenting like a single preferred method for sort of cross-cultural issues, or really just one particular approach? And let me give you an example which maybe makes it a bit more interesting, right? So I think of a text like the Tao Te Ching, right, where you have this idea, for example, of absence creates presence, right? What makes a house are the spaces, the doors and the windows. What makes the cup useful is the hole in the cup. You know, that's a really sort of powerful imagistic idea. And it's possible to sort of take that idea, reflect on it, and consider sort of what it means, what implications it has, how we can imaginatively extend this idea. You think of, you know, the usefulness of the useless in Zhuangzi, right? Another very kind of potent idea. But in a way, you could say this is a kind of comparative philosophy. But it's a comparative philosophy, if we call it that, which doesn't require the same kind of insight, theoretical structure, like really deep, nuanced understanding of conceptual schemes that you can bring together and then move a concept from one to the other to sort of gain insight. And I'm interested in how you view that kind of approach, because one of the advantages of this other approach is that potentially it's sort of accessible, it can still be useful, insightful. And at the start of your talk, you did have a kind of critique of other methods. So I'm just sort of curious about how you view a method like this, which doesn't seem to meet a lot of your criteria, but may still be a method of comparative philosophy.
Thank you. Of course, as I just said in my comment to Mercedes' comment, it is not a single method. It is also not the best method. It is the method that suits me at the moment, at this particular moment, the best, because I'm into it. I'm working on these issues. I would like to improve it and write a book only on this method. But this by no means, it means that I'm neglecting all the other methods, or that I say, well, this is the single best method. It is one of the many approaches. As I have I have emphasized that already, and I do it again. I think the approach you were just describing with this Lauder's absence and drawing this usefulness of uselessness of uselessness. These are wonderful approaches also, and they can all, live and let live. They can all live parallelly, and also I am completely sure that I won't be using this sublation method as a single method also in my research till the very end of my life. It is one of the approaches I find somehow reasonable and useful, but there are many others who are at least as it depends on what you want. What are you interested in? What kind of question arises from your mind, and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. I am completely aware of the fact that it is very late in China, right? It is midnight, basically.
Yeah.
But I would still like to give opportunity to Vitis, and this will be the last question. So.
A short question also. Let us leave the people. Let the people sleep. Yeah. Okay. Hi, Vitis. Hi, Vitis.
Hi, Jana. Hi, everybody. Thank you for your lecture. It's actually two questions, so I don't know. Just pick up one. They kind of related with each other. How do you deal with the problem of criteria according to which this identification of similarities is being put forward? I think it's something that Ralph Weber would call a tertium comparationis problem.
Yes.
Who sets the criteria? What is the status of this criteria? Are these criteria assumed? If they're not explicit, isn't there a danger to start on the wrong foot, so to speak? Just from assuming, maybe wrongly assuming that there are similarities. And my second question is kind of related to what Professor Foust was saying about the skepticism towards paying attention to cultural contexts. And then the question of mine is, what is the status of our own cultural contexts? Where does your sublation method include critical reflection of cultural context of the comparer, of the person who is doing, or the sublimator? How would you call it? Yeah. Person who uses sublation.
Sublator.
Sublator.
Okay.
Yeah, so as I say, maybe just pick what is better for you to answer.
I think they are interconnected somehow. I think that this problem of criteria I have pointed out in my lecture, it is a big problem because it is somehow that which really defines the whole process. And how I would like to avoid is precisely through the, these two comparanta in this process are not being somehow evaluated. So it is not about which theory is better, which one is right, which one is wrong. It is about how they can complement each other in order to bring forth something new. And of course, this is what the concept of transcultural here also exposes, because this prefix trans is not only about transcending one culture, but it also points to what Mercedes has already also mentioned, that we are all transformed in this whole process, and it is good, to be conscious about it, to make that aware. And regarding in this context, what is now the status of our own cultural context? I personally, why I started study sinology, the main reason is because I wanted to learn more about my own cultural context. And I think that the fact that we are dealing with these so-called foreign, non-European, non-Western cultures is actually because we can, on every step of our way, we can learn something new about us, you know, in the mirror of, and I think that I am developing. I emphasize I am developing, not I was. I have developed, because it is not developed yet, this method in such a spirit. Also, I'm completely aware that my own cultural context also plays a very important role in the whole process.
Thank you, Jana.
Thank you, Vitis.
I have to say something. I just have to. So, see you later, sublater. Isn't it nice? No, I'm joking.
Perfect.
So, yeah. So thank you very much first to Paul, who is organizing these great events. Second, to Professor Jana Rošker for giving us this inspiring lecture. To both commentators, Professor Peng-White and Professor Mathew Foust. To you, audience. And can I just use this opportunity to invite all of you to the lecture which will be taking place next month. This is 14th of March. Why? Because Professor Anne Peng-White will be will have a lecture on reappraising Banjiao, and Jana will be one of the commentators in this lecture. So without further ado, I give the word final remarks or final words to you, Paul.
Taya, you did such a better job than I could ever do. So all I can do is thank you for doing such a great job. And Jana, yeah, I mean, this was an amazing talk, really. My favorite one yet, but maybe just because it's the most recent. But I think it's my favorite one. Yeah, and thanks everyone. The whole idea is just to come together and have good discussions. So this was an excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to all of you.
See you.
Good night.
See you. Good night.
Good morning. So, ciao.